Welcome back. This will be part 2 of my coverage of the film Joker for PSY 300 Movies of Madness. Last time we had ended with we ended the discussion with a little bit on the issue of violence in films with characters with mental illnesses. Now we're going to continue that discussion and go in more depth. And I'll be covering a fair amount of what your author, Otto Wall, had described in terms of the difficulty of having this kind of content in films of this kind, even when they have positive messaging included. So the violence is obvious in this film, and what the filmmaker has done is to kind of lead you to believe that the traumas that Arthur has faced in his life have led him to a point of absolute despair, and the only way he finds out of that despair is to use the gun he didn't acquire of his own volition. He was given it, and then he becomes more and more and more intentionally violent, moving from self-defense uses of the weapon to tracking people down and murdering them, to, in a very brazen way, murdering someone on the set of a television show. Now, the invitation to the Murray Franklin show, which leads to later even more vivid acts of violence, but the culminating scene in the film where the Joker becomes the true iconic Batman lore villain in the film is when he murders Murray Franklin on the set of the show. Now, in the story, he's invited to the show because a viral video has come out showing his stand-up act, and he's made fun of on the program previous. Then he's cold called and invited to the show, and he arrives and asks that he be introduced as Joker, and admits on the program that he's murdered the Wall Street young Wall Street men on the subway. So so he's invited to kind of make his statement, and it's expected to be funny, but it turns quite literally deadly serious. What this sends as a message is very clearly that if people with mental illness aren't controlled, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get very brazen, very overt acts of violence, but also then the more demonic version, the scene where he is interacting with his former co-workers, the other clowns, and he very intense, just in a most graphically violent way, murders the man who gave him the gun. And he's, his face is all white, he is shirtless, he has this very feral, wild quality to him, and then he lets the other person go, but has to help him to get out the door. It's a rather terrifying scene, and your sense is, as a viewer, that he's come apart at the seams, and he's fully descended into this state where nothing is forbidden any longer in terms of his behavior. Anyone who has damaged him, anyone who has harmed him, has earned a pretty automatic death sentence. Now, when that's coupled with what's seen as by some, including the director of the film, his statement that, what do you get when you cross a mentally ill loner with a society that abandons him and treats him like trash? You get what you effing deserve. It's at this point an iconic line. Well, for Todd Phillips, he sees that in a way as a positive message, but for mental health advocates, that is overwhelmingly a negative message because, and follow my logic here, what it says is if you don't drug down or lock up or restrain or keep separate and control people with mental illnesses, they will murder you. If you ignore them, they will murder you. If you treat them poorly, they will murder you. when the truth of the lives of people with real mental illnesses, while their frustration is echoed by the statement, their acting out with violence is not, it's not borne out in reality. The sub-message is that you have, and I've seen this not just in the superhero genre, or comic book hero kind of made into live action film genre, but in other areas as well, where you have a person who is delusional, who their delusions kind of grow to the point where they start to see themselves as messianic figures. So he kind of, in the imagery that you're shown, he becomes the king of the clowns, and their anarchic desire to sow chaos. And that becomes kind of the manifestation of his delusional state. So we have to ask the question, and this is a critical question for films like this, where you have the coupling of a person with a serious mental illness and very graphically violent behavior that's out of line with the proportions of what you would see in everyday life. It's problematic because these roles are typically, when you have an insane villain role, and I challenge you, after this lecture, try and make a list for yourself. Think of the biggest villains that you remember from watching cartoons as a kid, watching Disney films, watching your favorite films as an adult, your television shows. Think about villains, and then try and catalog just how many of them were described as crazy or mad or insane. And you'll find that it's quite a lot of them show up described in that way, or the way they are cast, the characters are cast, the actors have an appearance that may telegraph some form of insanity, or the way they're dressed, the way they move, the way they look is telegraphing that assumption to the audience. Now, Wall reports research that while it is dated at this point, again, remember that Wall's text that I'm having you read was published in 1995, but what I've found in terms of looking at media since I started teaching this class in the early 2000s, the landscape hasn't changed, and in some ways it's become worse. So Goldstein's analysis that Wall reports, they found that quote-unquote mentally ill villains that showed up on police detective dramas or police procedurals tend to be shown to you as the audience as being more dangerous than other kinds of criminals. So, for example, and this wasn't a show that was in Goldstein's study, obviously, because it came out after that, but if you look at shows like the various incarnations of Law and Order, there, especially if you look at the versions of it like Criminal Intent or SVU, there seems to be a pretty clear difference between the way in which the perpetrators who are being presented to you as having a mental illness, their acts of violence tend to be more bizarre and more graphic, and bizarrely enough, more sexually motivated. So there's a lot of loaded messaging going on there in the police procedural genre. Gerbner also reported in the Wall chapter that I had you read, they found that mentally ill characters were more likely to be shown as villains, or to be engaging in what they call villainous behavior, so immoral behavior, psychopathic behavior, and so on. These characters, and this is a conclusion that you can draw from the research that we have available at this point in time. These are characters that tend to be presented to you in a fairly black and white way. They're all evil, they're all amoral all the time. Now, in the case of Joker, you have a more nuanced presentation. He's not just a straight up villain. In comparison to Jack Nicholson's version of the Joker, That version of the Joker, he's just bad. He started that way and he stayed that way. This version, Joaquin Phoenix's version of Joker, he starts out kind of pathetic and sad and disturbed and descends to this point of a complete manifestation of amoral evil. Wall argues that viewers, when they see this illusory correlation between mental illness and dangerous, violent behavior, when they see video or text or whatever kind of media presentation, they tend to see these characters as more active, more confused, aggressive, dangerous, and so on. When you compare that to other characters without a mental illness or characters with a mental illness who are not presented as being in the villain role. So there's something really different about the villain role. And then linking for your audience, giving them the handy explanation of this person having a mental illness, and that explains why they are an evil villain in the first place. Wall goes on to report other kinds of research studies. So in this case, they were looking at news stories in UPI reporting. Again, this is dated, but if you add, the media landscape now is so dense, it's so filled with sources that my guess would be, and of course it's an empirical question, but I'm guessing that this is simply not changed. The content analysis that Wall reports, he found that stories that dealt with people who have a history of being in a psychiatric hospital, that notation that this is a person with a history of mental illness tends to be added when there's a story of a violent crime. So if you have, a domestic violence murder in a home or another kind of violent crime, reporters have a tendency to go looking for that mental health history to try and find out if that's a possible explanation for why this horrible crime has happened. In the media, and we're shifting back to fiction here, when fiction writers, when film writers, television writers present you with killers who have a history of mental illness or who are actively mentally ill, they tend to be presented in a very specific way. This is starting to change, especially with respect to this finding. Many, at the time the Wall text was published, it was true that the majority of killers that were presented as having mental illness, they tended to be male. That there is still an edge for males, but we're seeing an uptick. More and more and more female characters are being presented as having a mental illness. But there's still a tendency for these characters to be male and to be very wantonly sadistic. Female characters who are sadistic murderers tend to be the partners of similarly sadistic males. Regardless, they tend overwhelmingly to murder women, which is an interesting phenomenon. The tools that have been found to be used in the content analyses that Wall reports, and I continue to see this in the films that I watch, you have, in addition to guns, which are still quite commonplace, but you have more up close and personal types of brutality. So you have, in addition to using guns, which can kill at a distance, you also have beatings with hands. We saw that in Joker. In addition to the gunplay, you have him, really smashing someone's head into the floor. The use of knives and other sharps is seen as a much more personal way of murdering someone. You have to touch them, their blood gets on you, and that's considered to be a more brutal form of violence. So what Wall is reporting here is that there is a tendency among writers to have killers who are mentally ill engage in more brutal, more personal attacks of homicide. The suggestion, Wall's conclusion is that the suggestion that is sort of planted in the person's mind is that the cause of the criminal behavior, the cause of the homicidal behavior, the beatings, the whatever, that the cause of that is the mental illness itself. And you get that message in Joker, regardless of how much you might like the film. He is presented to you right off the bat as being off his meds. So if his symptoms are not being controlled and his mental illness has now, fully manifested itself, it's undeniable that the message you're going to take away from that is that it is the mental illness itself that is driving the violent behavior that he exhibits. And that's the conclusion that Wall makes kind of generally about these kinds of presentations. So again, you have to add to that there's often a clear suggestion that these are people who can't be fixed. Remember that in the conversation early in the film with the social worker, he asks for a change in his medication, and he's told, you're already on a lot of medication, it should be doing something. That tells the audience that A, he's on a whole lot of drugs, and B, they're not doing anything for him. He's still sick. And then, there's a shift in the storyline where it's become clear that he is not on his medication, he's run out, and he's not getting any more. So again, the audience member is left to do the math and say A causes B. Mental illness causes violence. In addition, I found this to be especially the case in television, in police procedurals. The killers that are written into these police procedurals are often, I would say, again, it's an empirical question, but my casual observation is somewhere just above half of the time, killers who are presented to the audience as having a mental illness tend to end up dead. They aren't heroes of stories. They tend to be brutal themselves and without redemption. So they tend to be dealt with very harshly. They tend to be either locked up permanently or killed themselves in gunplay, often with police officers. The justification here is that and think about Joker, he's locked up, but he's still murdering people. The very closing scene of the film is shown with his bloody footprints, and you're left to infer that he has murdered the psychiatrist with his own hands, even despite the fact that he's handcuffed. So that sends you a pretty clear message that, number one, he's not being helped, he can't be helped, and he's now superhuman to the point where he can murder someone with his bare hands even when his hands are tied. There's also a message, this isn't so much in Joker as the case where I've seen in other kinds of film presentations or in television, there is kind of a communicated message that these are people who are actually suffering greatly and can't help themselves, therefore they need to be put down like a rabid dog would be put down before it harms others and continues to suffer. Now, Wall concludes chapter 4 with giving you some basic information, and sadly, the information that he presented in 1995 when this book was published is still relevant. It's still pretty much the same as what we knew back then, with some added components in terms of new research, and I'll share that with you here. So Wall starts by saying that there is a kernel of truth to the connection between mental illness symptoms and dangerousness, but it's in a very narrow bandwidth of types of mental illness and circumstances in which the person with that mental illness is living. So, for example, for people with severe and persistent mental illness, and that's a phrase that you'll probably hear me say a lot over the course of the semester, these are individuals who have very severe symptoms of whatever diagnosis they have. Treatments that have been tried are limited in terms of their effectiveness. They may not have access to effective treatments. They may not have the ability to maintain a rigorous course of their treatments. Whatever the cause, their treatments are ineffective at the current time. Now, most of the time, that's because these are individuals who often just don't have access to appropriate care or consistent care. Typically, what you're talking about, if you're saying you have a person with a severe mental illness who exhibits dangerous and or violent behaviors, what you're seeing is a person typically who has the severest possible form of a disorder. But more than that, because that's even a limited correlation, more than that, if you have a person with a history of psychotic illness, so where you have delusions and hallucinations, particularly when those hallucinations and delusions have a persecutory kind of tone to them and a paranoid kind of tone to them, and that person has a simultaneous drug and alcohol problem, those are individuals who are at the highest risk of engaging in violent behavior. But even then, such individuals are pretty rare. Overwhelmingly, what we see when we look at the research literature is that the causal connection between violence and mental illness is limited at best. Violent behavior, whether you're talking about people with mental illness or not, violence is a very complex human social behavior, and therefore it is caused by many, many, many things, and there are many variables that have a stronger connection or a stronger predictive value in explaining violence than mental health status does. People with mental illnesses, and that includes the type of mental illness that I was talking about earlier, where you have a person who has a severe and persistent mental illness with elements of psychosis and perhaps psychosis of a particular kind. Even in that narrow group defined as such, those are individuals who are far more likely to be dangerous to themselves than they are to other people. And the other people who may be harmed by them tend to fall into fairly clear categories: family members and first contact, or first responders and healthcare providers. So people with whom they have lots of contact. It's not strangers in a subway car. That's a very rare occurrence. But if you're watching police procedurals and you're watching films such as Joker, it's as if the rampage gets loosed and strangers are the ones who are going to pay. In reality, it's most likely to be irritability and disruptiveness and self-destructiveness that can sometimes spill over when symptoms are at their peak into engagements with other people. Now, it's not that extreme acts of violence never happen. They do. And you can't walk away from that fact. There are, in fact, some individuals who have mental illnesses who do exhibit very dangerous, very violent behavior. But in the population at large, people who commit very bad crimes, very violent crimes, are typically not people with mental illness. They typically are very bad people. And that's probably too trite a way to put it. They tend to be antisocial. They tend to have a long criminal past and a long history of violent behavior, but can't really be diagnosed with any of the illnesses that we tend to see tied to violent behavior in film, such as schizophrenia. The second point that Wall makes that is still current is that the vast majority of people with mental illnesses typically don't express violence or dangerousness in their everyday lives. Now here Wall is referring to the very broad definition of people with mental illness. That means any category of mental illness. At this stage in your journey in Movies and Madness, you may still be kind of drifting. When I say mental illness or people with mental illness, there's probably still a prototype in your mind that says that's a person with a psychotic disorder, with a disorder like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, where there are hallucinations and delusions. You need to broaden your perspective there. If we look at the whole, people with mental illness are typically, they make up about, let me back up. People who exhibit violent and dangerous behavior, in that wider category of people with mental illness, it's about 10 to 12%. So 90-some% of people who are diagnosed with a mental illness are not violent. And one of the really important things that you need to think about right now, and this number, this is the 1995 number, actually this number is far, far higher now. There are estimates, and it varies tremendously from state to state. In some states, this percentage is more like 70%, where when you're looking at an incarcerated population, rates of mental illness, 1995 used to be about 20%. 2020, you're talking anywhere from 60 to 85% of any given jail or prison's population being people with mental illnesses. And what's going on there is, after deinstitutionalization in the 1960s and 70s, that doesn't mean that people with severe and persistent mental illnesses, which tend to be criminalized in our communities in a variety of ways, there was nowhere for people to go. So the criminal justice system has, by default, become the major mental health provider in pretty much every state in the United States. We'll talk about that more as the course unfolds. For some of you who are criminal justice majors or minors, you may want to give some thought to that, to updating this percentage. This 20% is no longer accurate. That percentage is much, much higher now. As I mentioned earlier, the violence piece, when people behave violently, when they behave aggressively, and this is regardless of whether you have a mental illness or not, violence is better predicted by such things as having a substance abuse problem, being a young person, so being under 25, being poor, and that's a loaded statement, but in the research it's a correlated factor, and being male. So if you really want to create, and sociological research has shown this, a predictive model of who's most likely to be violent in their lives, substance abuse, youth, poverty, and male gender tend to be much more solid predictors of violent behavior than being diagnosed with a mental illness. Third, Wall points out that, and I alluded to this earlier, when violence does occur, it's rarely, if ever, directed at strangers. With violent crime in general, you are most likely, if you're going to become a victim of a violent crime, it's usually the people you have the most contact with who are likely to hurt you. So just as is the case with all violent crimes, people with mental illness, when their behavior becomes disruptive to the point of violence, it tends to be people in their own families, people that they have lots of contact with, and first responders and healthcare providers. Serial killers, unlike the impression that we are all kind of trained to have from the media, you've kind of been conditioned to imagine there's a serial killer living on every block in the United States. Serial killers who are stranger attackers are actually statistically very, very rare. As a true crime fan, I watch a lot of documentary shows about crimes, and if I weren't, kind of holding on to my critical thinking hat with both hands, I would become convinced that these serial killers are everywhere and they are on the hunt for strangers constantly. But in fact, the kinds of serial killers that are written about so extensively in fiction are rare, and that's unfortunate because the way these characters are written, they are routinely then described as also having a mental illness, and the association with schizophrenia in particular is very problematic. Fourth, Wall points out, and we don't talk about this a lot in this class. Again, if some of you are criminal justice majors or minors, you might want to give this a little bit more of your attention. At the time when Wall was writing, there was 1995, and you're young, and this is out of your consciousness, but during the era when Wall was writing this text, we had kind of, as a country, been through this a real hot point in the conversation about the insanity defense, because there was the murders of the attempt to assassinate the President Reagan, was committed by a person with a severe mental illness. And that meant that there was just a whole lot of conversation about the insanity defense. And then there was the murder of John Lennon from the Beatles by a person who was described in the press at the time as delusional and psychotic. So there was a lot of public discourse during the 20 or so years prior to Wall publishing Media Madness. And the sense was, the public outcry was, don't let people get off easy by using the insanity defense. They deserve to be locked up. They should be put to death. And, adding the layer of mental illness to this was something that made it even worse. So what Wall is pointing out here is that the insanity defense, contrary to public opinion, doesn't result in large numbers of people who are dangerous being released. If you are successful, and that's a rarity because the insanity defense isn't used very often. You'd think based on television it's used all the time and quite successfully, but in fact it's rarely employed because the standards are very stringent, and even when it is used, it doesn't work most of the time because juries tend not to buy it. When the defense succeeds, which was the case with the attempted assassination of President Reagan, the person doesn't go free. They're not going to be released. They are incarcerated essentially in a psychiatric facility. Most of the time, and statistical analyses bear this out, most of the time when someone is found guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, or they've successfully used the insanity defense, their incarceration is pretty much indefinite. They usually spend far longer in a facility than they would have if they had been found guilty without that defense at all. So Wall concludes, given all of these facts, Wall concludes that the way writers and directors typically present this connection between violence and mental illness is inaccurate, and I would tend to agree that the proportion is off. We tend to see far too many characters who are communicated to you as the viewer as being people with mental illness. Far too many of them are also violent, and the causal connection between their mental illness and their violence is made really clear to the viewer. You also have a very extreme exaggeration of the number of serial killers that far outstrips what's present in reality. And that tends to make people leap to the conclusion there's something truly, truly bizarrely deviant about a serial killer, which I can't really disagree with that. But they're rare, and the explanation you're typically given in the media is that serial killers have psychotic disorders, when in fact most serial killers can't be diagnosed with a mental illness at all, other than perhaps antisocial personality disorder. And finally, when we look at true stories, when those true stories involve people with mental illnesses who do in fact commit violent crimes, they tend to be quite sensational stories. So they are seen as being, really, really important to report on. I was describing the assassination attempt on President Reagan, the murder of John Lennon. In more recent years, you have the mass shooting at Virginia Tech by a young man who had a history of mental illness, and the shooting in the Aurora, Colorado movie theater, where you had an individual with mental illness involved in that crime. Those are just examples. So these tend to be really salacious stories, and the connection between mental illness is kind of highlighted in these stories in much the same way that Todd Phillips capitalizes on in the film Joker, because essentially he is saying, ignore us at your peril. If you ignore us, we will tear you down. And that's really unfortunate as messaging goes. Now, remember in my opening lecture of looking at stigma as a social problem, I talked about those key characteristics that we tend to see in presentations of people with mental illness. If we're evaluating Joker and, think of this as a checklist, check that box. You have a dangerous man. Unpredictability, you can check that box too. He's unpredictable. Childlikeness and incompetency are a little trickier, but you certainly, in the way Joker is dressed in the first half of the film, he is presented in a way that kind of communicates being a boy in a man's body. There are times when he just doesn't seem to understand the nature of the world, like, for instance, carrying a gun into a children's hospital ward, and so on. Blameworthiness, as I described it earlier in part one, is by extension, in this case, the blameworthiness is projected onto the mother in this film, and that happens pretty often in films in this genre. And you get clear messages of untreatability and the potential for contagion. It's not accidental that, whether it's real or delusion, that there appears to be a sudden growth of a social movement of clown-masked anarchists. I've seen that in other film representations, where you have an anti-hero who is a person who's vulnerable and has a mental illness but becomes a messianic figure. And that's like a sub-category of the contagion narrative. So we've pretty much checked off every single one of the boxes. Now, I'm not going to give you my opinion because I don't want to taint your opinions. You get to have your own opinion about the film. And this will be your first chance to go through this exercise of saying, if I put it on a scale from 1 to 10, how much stigmatizing messaging is there that's going to push people to have negative perceptions of people with mental illness? And I'm going to leave it there.